Tens of thousands of people stand shoulder to shoulder inside a packed stadium. The music swells. Familiar lyrics merge into a single, collective affirmation. At the center of those lights stands Tim McGraw, a name that has existed long enough to become a symbol, solid enough to seem as if there is nothing left to prove. People see a steady career, a complete family, an image so stable it feels almost flawless. But there is a quiet paradox beneath it all. Some people reach everything the world dreams of. Yet, the higher they stand, the farther they drift from something very simple, the feeling of being exactly where they belong. For Tim McGraw, fame did more than bring recognition. It also concealed unnamed voids, fears carefully hidden behind discipline, tour schedules, and the image of a reliable man. This is not a story of a loud downfall, nor is it about a scandal exposed. This is a story about the unseen side of glory. When a person is forced to be strong for too long, until they forget what it feels like to know why they are living at all. And to understand why Tim McGraw once drifted so far from the feeling of belonging, we have to return to where everything first took shape. Before the lights, before the stage, and before the name the world came to know. Before the stage, before the cheers, Tim McGraw grew up inside a kind of absence that is hard to name. He was born in 1967 in Louisiana, a place where music, faith, and a slower rhythm of life blend together. Yet the force that shaped him earliest was not song. It was absence. Tim had a father, but not a present one. The name Tug McGraw existed as a distant figure in newspapers, an untouchable symbol. For a child, that distance was not loud. It was quiet, prolonged, and left behind an unanswered question. Was I important enough to be stayed for? In that environment, Tim developed a survival mechanism very early. No expectations, no complaints. Carry everything himself. He learned how to be strong before he learned how to be fully loved. And that independence later became a double-edged blade. It pushed him forward, but made it difficult to admit his need to be held. Music entered Tim's life as a refuge, not from a desire to become a star, but because within it, he could speak the things he could not say out loud. The raw simplicity of country music gave him a sense of belonging, something his childhood had never fully provided. But early fractures do not disappear when we grow older. They only change shape. The hunger for recognition, the fear of being left behind, and the habit of pouring his entire self into a goal, all of it followed Tim into adulthood, quietly shaping the choices he would later make. And when he left Louisiana to search for a path in Nashville, it was not merely a career move. It was a departure in search of identity, a hope that if he went far enough, if he worked hard enough, that sense of absence would finally stop chasing him. Yet it was precisely where he went looking for belonging that another fire began to burn. A fire that would carry Tim McGraw onto a road with no turning back. In the late 1980s, when Tim McGraw left Louisiana and arrived in Nashville, he didn't step into a city of opportunity. He stepped into a trial that would last for years. Nashville didn't need another voice. It demanded endurance. And Tim learned that lesson the slowest way possible. The early days passed in silence. Music couldn't support him yet. He took on whatever temporary jobs he could just to survive. Nameless shifts, long days, evenings returning to a small room, exhausted, yet still holding on to his guitar. Music wasn't a backup plan. It was the only thing keeping him from leaving. Between 1990 and 1992, Tim began appearing more regularly in bars and small venues. These performances didn't bring recognition, only the feeling of standing in the right place. even if it lasted just a few minutes each night. No bright lights, no large crowds, but every time he sang, he knew he hadn't chosen the wrong direction. Then a very small turning point arrived. Not a breakthrough, but a permission, a trial contract, the chance to record his first demos. To outsiders, it was paperwork. To Tim, it was the first time Nashville acknowledged his existence. By 1993, his debut album was released. It didn't instantly turn Tim McGraw into a star, but it marked something more important. Music was no longer a side dream. Shows began to draw more people. His name started to circulate. And at the same time, the pace accelerated. Tim entered a phase where everything began moving faster than he could fully absorb. Before the struggle of survival had time to fade, a new pressure appeared. The pressure to keep going, to hold on to the momentum. For someone who had once feared being left behind, stopping was never an option. That first flame was lit in years of quiet persistence, in temporary jobs and nights spent singing for almost no one. It drove Tim McGraw forward at a speed that allowed no hesitation, and that same flame would later become the force that both lifted him higher and forced him to learn how to control himself. Because when the real doors of fame finally opened, Tim McGraw didn't just step into the spotlight. He stepped into a role upon which all of America began to place its expectations. By 1994, Tim McGraw's career shifted onto a different trajectory. Indian Outlaw hit the radio at precisely the moment America was searching for a new kind of figure. Not overly glamorous, not distant from everyday life, but strong enough to represent the ordinary emotions of the middle class. The album, Not a Moment Too Soon, quickly carried Tim from a rising name to the center of country mainstream. This was not a random explosion, but a rare alignment between an artist's identity and the needs of the era. From 1994 to 1997, Tim McGraw appeared almost continuously on the charts. #1 songs followed one another, and at the same time, award shows began calling his name, first as recognition, then as confirmation of status. Wins at the CMA and ACM didn't just hand him trophies, they framed Tim as country's reliable man, a role the public quickly grew accustomed to and expected to remain unchanged. By the late 1990s, Tim's glow was no longer confined to music. He became a cultural symbol, a storyteller of everyday lives, with a voice close enough to trust, strong enough to lean on. Repeated Male Vocalist of the Year titles weren't merely celebrating technique, they reinforced an expectation. Tim McGraw had to remain consistent with the image, and once an image becomes shared public property, the space for mistakes begins to shrink. Entering the early 2000s, Tim's career reached another kind of peak. A peak of depth. Set This Circus Down, 2001, revealed an artist long familiar with fame, beginning to look inward. But it was Live Like You Were Dying, 2004, that made the shift unmistakable. The title song touched fears of loss, limited time, and the choices of how to live. And that honesty earned a Grammy, not through spectacle, but by striking at the shared anxieties of an entire generation. From this point on, Tim McGraw was no longer just a star. He became an emotional guide for those moving into midlife. Yet precisely when everything seemed most secure, a paradox began to form. Tim's halo was built from talent, timing, and institutional recognition, but it also locked the real person behind a wall of victories. Every trophy placed in his hands added another expectation. Never miss a beat. For someone who grew up with the fear of being left behind, that recognition was both reward and restraint, because losing public trust meant returning to the old feeling of belonging nowhere. And so pressure changed its shape. Success was no longer something to chase, but a condition that had to be maintained. Tim McGraw stepped onto award stages with the calm of someone accustomed to winning, yet behind that composure lay relentless schedules and a role that left no room for weakness. He was loved for his steadiness, and that very steadiness made it hard to admit exhaustion. When fame becomes a position you cannot step away from, the cracks inside begin to widen in silence. And no matter how bright the lights burn, they cannot forever conceal the erosion behind the name. When fame became a permanent state, Tim McGraw entered a phase that was almost impossible to detect from the outside. There were no more explosions, no defining breakthrough moments, only a repeating cycle where one show ended and another began, and exhaustion was carefully masked by a familiar smile. The pressure now no longer came from competition, but from the expectation of remaining perfectly aligned with the image. Tim was loved for his steadiness, for the sense of safety he gave his listeners. And that very expectation left no space for weakness. Each time fatigue surfaced, he learned to push it aside, just as he had learned to do in childhood. Alcohol entered the story not as a scandal, but as a temporary switch. It slowed down questions that had no easy answers. It softened the invisible fear that one misstep could make everything collapse. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, relentless touring and continuous praise left Tim with no quiet moments to recognize how much he was wearing down. The most dangerous part was this: these fractures did not contradict success. They coexisted with it. Tim still stood on stage, still accepted awards, still embodied the figure America trusted. But behind that image, an old survival mechanism was at work. The mechanism of a child who once feared being left behind, now wrapped in the armor of fame. The more he was recognized, the more he felt compelled to prove that he deserved it. Family became both an anchor and a mirror. When Tim began to see what he stood to lose, he grew more aware of the cost hidden behind the spotlight, not through a loud collapse, but through subtle signs: a body pushing back, a spirit slowly draining, and a quiet fear that if he kept going this way, he would repeat the same cycle that once caused him pain. That undercurrent storm did not emerge to destroy his career. It surfaced to force Tim McGraw to stop and truly face himself, something the glow of fame had allowed him to postpone for far too long. And when the signs could no longer be ignored, a difficult decision began to take shape, a decision that would alter the trajectory of his entire life. There was no collapse dramatic enough to make headlines, no fall captured by cameras. For Tim McGraw, the breakdown happened in the hardest way to see. It arrived while everything still looked fine. In the mid-2000s, when his career was secure and fame no longer needed proving, Tim began to realize something unsettling. He wasn't tired from working too much. He was tired because he no longer knew what he was running toward. The packed tour schedules, the repeated congratulations, the familiar trophies. All of it created a smooth, polished surface, a place where real emotion could no longer take hold. Public opinion didn't push him aside. The industry didn't turn its back. The one who forced Tim McGraw to stop was himself, when his body spoke before his mind did. The warning signs weren't loud, but they were clear enough to understand that if he kept going, he would lose more than just fame. The decision to change didn't arrive as a bold declaration. It emerged through quiet conversations, evenings without lights, and a growing realization. He was on the verge of repeating a cycle of absence, the very pattern that had haunted his childhood. A career could endure a few more years of acceleration. A family could not. The hardest part wasn't letting go of old habits. It was stepping out of a role. Tim had grown used to the image of the man who was always strong, always in control. But to keep living, he had to accept an opposing truth. Weakness is not failure. Refusing to stop is the real risk. So Tim McGraw did not disappear. He deliberately narrowed his life, reset his pace, and cut away what was pulling him further from himself. The decision wasn't applauded. It didn't bring instant approval or image points, but for the first time, he chose to stay with his own life, instead of chasing the expectations of the crowd. This breakdown did not end the journey. It opened another path, slower, harder, and lonelier, where Tim McGraw had to learn how to live when the lights were no longer providing shelter. When the lights pulled back, Tim McGraw didn't step into an undefined void. He stepped into real life, where fame no longer served as a shield. There, no one cared how many records he had sold or how large the stages once were. The only question that mattered was whether he was truly present. Those slower years did not resemble the peace people often imagine. They were demanding. After years of living in constant motion, Tim had to learn how to stay still, inside his own home, with emotions that could no longer be pushed aside by tour schedules or applause. It was in that stillness that his body and mind began to demand the honesty he had postponed for far too long. Family became the center of this phase, and also the one place where no performance was allowed. Standing beside Tim as everything was forced to change was Faith Hill, the woman he married in 1996, at a time when both were at the height of their careers. Their marriage was never a perfect fairy tale. Two famous people, two relentless schedules, two personalities long accustomed to carrying their own weight, together forming a relationship that constantly required adjustment to stay on course. It was during the period when Tim had to slow down that marriage became the clearest test. Not because love was lacking, but because fame had occupied too much living space. Faith Hill did not appear as a savior, but as a clear boundary. If Tim did not change, what he stood to lose would no longer be his health or his career. It would be the family he was building. Their 3 daughters entered Tim's life not as symbols, but as an inescapable reminder. Through them, he saw what he himself had lacked in childhood, a present father. And it was the fear of repeating the old cycle, the quiet absence, that pushed Tim to begin changing from the smallest things, choosing to stay home more often, narrowing his schedule, and learning to place family ahead of the familiar rhythm of fame. Regular workouts were no longer about maintaining an image, but about restoring balance. Family conversations no longer revolved around achievements, but around boundaries, the boundary between dedication and sacrifice. Within that simpler life, Tim McGraw finally named the erosion behind fame, something that had accumulated over many years, yet had never truly been confronted. These years of searching did not turn Tim into a different person. They returned him to the proper place of being human, a husband, a father, an artist, learning to slow down in order not to lose what cannot be replaced. Music did not disappear, but it was no longer an escape. It waited until life outside had regained its sense of order. And while the world believed Tim McGraw had gone quiet, something else was quietly forming. A return not built on glow, but on clarity, where family no longer stood behind the lights, but at the center of every choice. From that ordinary ground, a new chapter began, unloud, unproven, and no longer disconnected from real life. Tim McGraw's return did not begin with a grand announcement. There was no loud comeback, no message of "I survived," just a different rhythm of life, slower, more aware, from which music quietly found its way back. When Tim stepped onto the stage again, the first thing that changed wasn't his voice, but how he stood beneath the lights. Gone was the strain of a figure who had to remain unshakable. In its place was the calm of someone who understood boundaries, who knew he was there to share, not to escape. The songs he chose to sing no longer tried to prove anything. They carried the weight of lived experience. The music in this phase breathed differently. Less showmanship, more space. Each line felt deliberately placed after life outside the stage had been put back into order. Tim didn't return to reclaim a position. He returned because he was finally ready to be there, with himself, with the audience, and with his family. His marriage to Faith Hill no longer stood behind the lights as a distant support. It became a compass for new choices, tours weighed carefully, time redistributed, and every decision measured against one simple question: would this take away the presence my family needs? That question kept Tim grounded in a pace that was enough, preventing him from slipping back into old cycles. What matters is this. This rebirth did not make Tim McGraw smaller. It made him clearer. The audience no longer saw a distant symbol, but a human being stepping onto the stage with scars that had been acknowledged. And that honesty created a different kind of connection, steadier, deeper, and no longer dependent on instant glow. Tim McGraw did not choose to walk away from music. He chose to remain without trading himself away, to remain within a career reordered, where family is no longer something to be sacrificed, and the lights are no longer the only refuge. And from that point of balance, the remaining question is no longer how big Tim McGraw's return will be, but what will stay behind when the applause finally fades. When Tim McGraw no longer steps onto the stage to escape himself, but simply to tell what he has lived through, the story naturally leads to another question. What truly remains when the applause fades? For Tim McGraw, the answer is not found in a single peak moment, but in the long trail he has left across American music and cultural life. For more than 3 decades, Tim McGraw's songs have accompanied multiple generations, not as an overpowering voice, but as a steady narrator close enough to be trusted. That enduring presence has been affirmed through repeated honors at major awards, from the CMA and ACM to the Grammy Awards, not just for one song or one album, but for the full arc of his journey. Each trophy, at that stage, no longer signified conquest. It functioned more like a marker, acknowledging that the path Tim chose carried depth and staying power. What matters is this. Those awards never turned Tim McGraw into a distant icon. Instead, they reinforced the image of an artist who could stand at the center of country music while still retaining an unmistakably human everyday quality. When titles like Male Vocalist of the Year or Grammy wins were announced, the public didn't just see success. They saw a representative voice, someone articulating the simple yet hard-to-name emotions of America's middle class. That influence extended to the generations that followed. For many younger artists, Tim McGraw is not only a successful predecessor, but proof that a long career does not have to be paid for through self-destruction. In an industry that often glorifies intensity and sacrifice, Tim's path introduced a different standard. That it is possible to go far, receive full recognition, and still preserve personal boundaries. And when looking back at that legacy, the hit songs, the nights on stage, the moments of recognition, what lingers most deeply is not the number of awards. It is the way Tim McGraw learned to stop before losing himself, then returned with a voice that was more mature, more humane. The awards, at this point, feel less like fuel for another race and more like parentheses closing a long chapter. Tim McGraw's legacy, therefore, does not end in nostalgia. It exists as a quiet reminder that success only truly matters when it does not strip away the ability to live fully, and that some artists do not need to exit the spotlight through tragedy in order to be remembered for a long time. And when we look back at everything that has remained, the songs that accompanied multiple generations, the awards marking a career built on endurance, and a life rhythm that has been deliberately reordered, Tim McGraw's story arrives at a very quiet place. Not a climax, not a final victory. Just a moment still enough to realize that some people do not need to exit the spotlight through tragedy to be remembered. They remain in a different way, quieter but truer. Tim McGraw does not leave behind a flawless legend. He leaves behind the image of a man who traveled very far, came close to losing his own rhythm, and then learned how to protect what cannot be replaced. In a world that constantly demands more, faster, bigger, his story becomes a gentle reminder. Sometimes the hardest thing is not rising higher, but knowing when to stop. When the applause fades, what continues to echo is not the volume of fame, but the way a person lived alongside it. Tim McGraw did not defeat the spotlight. He did not run from it either. He simply learned to place it where it belonged, so that music, family, and self no longer had to cancel one another out. And perhaps the final question is not meant only for Tim McGraw. It belongs to all of us, those moving very fast through our own lives. If one day all the noise were to stop, what in your life would remain the longest? If this story touched you, share your thoughts below and subscribe to the channel to continue exploring journeys behind the spotlight, where fame steps back and the human being finally steps forward.